ceramic education, I think there's materials come to you in 55-pound bags, and sometimes I think it can be seen as a sort of a found object, as a kind of inert substance that, is completely neutral, sort of like it's separated from the environment from which it was mined. And so it got me thinking a lot more about Lake Michigan, about the local veins of mineral, about the architecture throughout the city, the Northwest Terracotta Works, and thinking about how, through access to our own materials, we can create a glaze recipe, a collection of potential surfaces, potential clay bodies that involve looking at these older recipes that we no longer have other materials to replicate, and reference them through, I guess, what we do have, and sort of highlight the difference between the sort of the jasperware and something that is more exclusive to Illinois. And looking throughout these books, you have Chelsea ware, Bowman factories in England trying to replicate Ming Dynasty porcelain, and how that has sort of fueled economies in terms of replication. And so I'm thinking about how that sort of lost in translation kind of generates a whole vernacular of form, because particular materials can only do certain things in relation to their tooling. So I became intimately inspired by trying to push toward that edge of getting materials to function in ways that I guess exploit their own material properties in ways that seem to point back into the past, but also acknowledge the extent at which they can behave and they can be gathered in our own sort of intimate space and environment.
Definitely, and I think that's the last thing I just wanted to mention, because I want to get started on the presentation on the Stratfordshire. But I mean, I think the idea that always struck me in the beginning of the main thing of the archive and the transmission of knowledge from the ancient Mayan, Aztec stone builders and the potters, from your grandfather would teach the father would teach the son how to work, to the Victorian era of reading in your Sears catalog how to build your house, through now what we're doing now with the thing, a talking head, how is knowledge transferred, bend to my here with technology in the 21st century. Now you can just be here if you were in, I think the possibilities are endless with that, and who knows, in another 100 years, well, there'll just be a small brain chip maybe we can implant, and they'll tell you how to perfectly build something, but we don't quite know what'll happen yet. I think now, just spend some time, since we started a little late, I'm gonna move you here, I'm gonna do this mini presentation, and at the end we'll take questions, okay?
Okay, that sounds great.
All right, I'm gonna move you so you get a show too. Okay. And now, continuation of what all that was. So this semester, I kind of took the research and I wanted to do something a little more. I was a history major in college, and I really wanted to do something a little more history oriented. Almost history, I think, told through the lens of ceramics. Let's play it right now. File open recent. File open recent. Together. Okay, slideshow. Okay, so I was a history major, and I wanted to, this slideshow is going to cover a pretty wide range of topics. Notes. Okay. Water. All right. Okay. Let's see. Now, first, I wanted to talk about some of the oddest things I found in the archive of ceramics, sort of the peculiarities. And the first thing we have right here, now we look at this image and we say, what is this? I say, why is this man on the bottom of a pot? And then if we look more closely, this is not a pot. This is a chamber pot, where back in the Victorian times you might do your business. And you say, well, why is this man in the bottom pot? This man is Ben Butler, Ben the Beast Butler. And how did this man end up on a pot? Well, the Civil War, the year is 1862, and the first major city of the Confederacy to be captured is New Orleans. And soon, Ben Butler becomes commandant of the New Orleans parish and city. And right off the bat, things don't go well when the first night a Southern man rips down the flag from the Mint building, and Butler promptly holds a cord and has the man hanged after they found a ripped piece of bunting from his shirt. This obviously didn't go well with the Southerners, and the Southern women were quite rude to Butler. I mean, they would spit at the Union troops when they walked by, go on the opposite side of the street, and they walked, leave the building, and things reached a boiling point at one point when a lady actually jumped her chamber pot, not Ben Butler with his face on this would come after, on Admiral David Farragut's head. In turn covering him with the refuse of human waste. And Butler made his proclamation, the General Orders 28. As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women calling themselves ladies of New Orleans in return for the most scrupulous non-interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter when any female shall shun word, gesture, or movement, and shall show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded as held liable to be treated as a woman of the town applying her vocation. Pretty much saying they'd be treated as a prostitute. The Southern women were Southern manhood and womanhood had been, disengaged, been trampled upon, and Ben Butler became known as the Beast Ben Butler. It also didn't help his case that he was notorious for going to abandoned buildings and stealing spoons from the mansion, also gaining the nickname Ben Spoons Butler. It also didn't help either that, he would take his personal position to gain financial gain, his brother, another general controlling the cotton trade. I love how Ben Butler is described. A short, fat, shapeless man with no neck, squinting eyes, a very bald head, and above all, that singular, half-defiant look. And this guy just didn't really give a crap that nobody liked him. He said, he that sins against me sins against the Holy Ghost, and in general just played loose with military friends and thought he had a free reign. Eventually he'd be taken off the command of New Orleans, but what you have to do to get your face on the bottom of the chamber pot, I was like, wow. And even so, he wouldn't even be the first man to have his face on the bottom of the chamber pot. That distinction goes to Napoleon Bonaparte himself. And the second thing, and I'm only going to focus on two because I want to get to the main lecture, is this. Now we look at, what is this little mug? No, this is actually a ceramic grenade. And a ceramic grenade, that seems so odd and out of place. And even antiquated, but it's not. This is a Japanese Type 4 ceramic grenade from 1944 and 1945. 1944, the war isn't going that well for Japan. MacArthur's island hopping campaign has been a success. U.S. is out on the doors of Japan. The greater Coast Asia prosperity sphere in ruins. But now the Japanese incite these last-ditch efforts from, really shoddily made Arisaka rifles with the worst weight to now these very handmade, there was no one that was the same, made in backyard kilns of these ceramic grenades. There was the idea in 1945 now that Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, there was no idea the war would end. They would say, to the sticks in 46, It was the idea that the invasion of Japan would take 1 million men, that behind every street house once they invaded would be the Japanese men and women with bamboo stick and their ceramic grenades willing to die for the emperor. Anyways, later, as we all well know, the atomic bombs were dropped and the invasion of Japan never happened. But what's so interesting is that, I'm going to get the exact number of it, the 500,000 Purple Hearts that have been manufactured since 1945 were all made for the Purple Heart is what you get in the military when you're wounded. Were all made for the invasion of Japan, and we expected that many casualties, and still we've only used 120,000 of those 500,000 Purple Hearts. Okay, And now let's get to the bulk of the lecture. I just really wanted to show people these two things. This lecture, I'm going to read a little mini thing, and the rest I'm just going to go off my knowledge and stuff I'm interested and passionate about. Prior to coming to SAIC, I'd been creating ceramic figures. The scenes I created were inspired by historical events, and even more so by the people that history has forgotten. I was particularly interested in the Victorian era, an era which has been recorded as the stories of heroes, men pushing back jungles, conquering new lands, a sun that never set, military triumphs. I wondered, where were the conquered, the failed explorers, the victims of European expansions, the footnotes of history? I hope to bring these lost figures to life, to have them step out of the photographs, lithographs, and letters that comprise the only record of their existence, and let them reemerge in 3 dimensions. The figures were small, much like the lives they represented, almost the opposite of historics. My subjects were often tragedies or pointless atrocities. The figures, while representational, were figurative. Their lack of color represent fading into obscurity. So now it brings me to the Shapiro Fellowship. Imagine my surprise when working on the Shapiro Foundation research with Ben D'Amate, I came upon the world of Stratfordshire figurines. This is one of them. The geography of Stratfordshire in central England conspired to make it a center for slipware and other lead-type glazed earthenware. Thick layers of clay lay only a few feet below the surface, and there was so much of the stuff 18th century potters dug clay right out of the roads, hence the phrase pothole. The figurines were made by pressing clay into plaster of Paris molds, often in a simple 2-part mold. Others had limbs and accessories that needed separate molding and required additional molds. Anyways, you know, I could go on about the history of Stratfordshire, but I don't want to bore anyone because it's not really about Stratfordshire. It's about my work, and I guess there's little stories I'm telling, or little anecdotal stories we can all relate to, and sort of the real story of these figures. These brightly colored ceramic figures, often representation of military religious figures, immediately entered into a dialogue with my own work. These were literally the G.I. Joes of their day, idealized 3-dimensional figures expressing the mythologies of an era. The idealizing nature of work became immediately apparent when photographs of the same figures or paintings were often my work compared to the Staffordshire figures, which I'll get to. In contrast, Staffordshire figures often seem childlike despite their details. My figures express just the opposite of idolization, sort of the dark side of the empire. You know, these figures were made in these factories where, like, the kids would make 200 a day, the kids would get silicosis from the dust, you know, and we have these little idealized figures, and I'll get to their stories later. But thus, the very people I was trying to represent in my work were the same anonymous, invisible figures that were being exploited by the dominant Victorian culture as they made the Stratfordshire pieces, raising important questions about the relationships between objects and those who make them. This line of questioning is most important in the field of ceramics, a field in which haptic experience with its unique sensory relationship to self is a central part of its creation. Today, I hope to set these different representations alongside each other to invite people to examine through this dialectic approach the way we construct our narratives about history and meaning we impart into our creation. Okay, sorry for that whole type thing. Let me get to this lecture. First here we have Ben Franklin, also we'll notice incorrectly labeled as Washington. I would like to think that they knew the difference, but not. Now the story of Ben Franklin. Actually quite the womanizer, supposedly dying of syphilis, but Ben's life has been always interesting to me. I mean, from inadvertently inventing the maxi pad as a bandage for a soldier with buckshot wounds, to writing a lecture on the benefits of farting, you know, flatulence, fart proudly, he would title it, to later sending a letter to a young friend on advice of choosing a mistress. And he suggests to choose an older woman at that, as a younger one might be more debauched. Okay, and now for some of my work. And I wanted to take these stories and tell my story of Ben Franklin, which is Ben Franklin receives the inspiration before Ben Franklin charges his lightning rod the night before signing the Declaration of Independence. Now, do we know Ben Franklin received fellatio the night before the writing of the Declaration of Independence? We don't, but I like to imagine he did. And that's the real story of the more lascivious side of Ben Franklin. And now we're going to get into what this lecture is really about. This is slightly pre-Victorian, but Admiral Nelson, Horatio Nelson. On the left, a lot of these images are going to be Stratfordshire and then the real Nelson. Nelson. Now, do we all know Horatio Nelson? Yes, we all do. We know him from the Battle of Trafalgar, or probably more commonly Trafalgar Square in London. Now, Nelson, we get the famous term, to turn a blind eye. Nelson would actually be blind in one eye. We can't see in either of these, but. And he would famously, when attacking Danish ships at a sea battle, he would put his, telescope to his blind eyes, like, well, I don't see them, and then charge ahead. It was actually funny. Nelson was actually seasick for the most of the 34 years of his career. And the other little thing about Nelson that I read actually is that for the last 6 years of his life, he was engaged with a menage a trois with the British ambassador to Naples and his wife. And he also had lost an arm in an action at Veracruz and had to eat with a small, unique little left-handed fork knife tool thing. And this is the Battle of Trafalgar, which really actually changed naval history. Previously, the two ship sides would just come up and just use only one side of their broadside. What Nelson did, crossing the T at Trafalgar, able to use both broadsides to completely destroy the French and Spanish fleets. And though things would not go so great for Nelson, as he would actually die at Trafalgar, being shot through the back from a Spanish marksman on the French ship Resolute. Luckily, he was able to be preserved in brandy and sent back to England. And now for Napoleon, as we continue on with the beginnings of this lecture on the Napoleonic era. I always love seeing what I've found with these Stratfordshire is the difference between the image and then even this image itself. When Napoleon crossed the Alps, it was on a mule, and it was snowing, and it wasn't his great horse Marengo. And Napoleon, his life himself is a life of contradictions. We think of Napoleon as short. In the end, Napoleon was 5'6". It was just that the French inch and the British inch, there was a mistranslation there. The life of Napoleon, of the 60 battles he would fight in, winning all but 7, and his name going into, anyone who gets an era named after them is, something to say. All the famous battles he would fight, the Battle of Austerlitz, one of probably his most famous battles, and the term the Beau Soleil de Austerlitz would come into memory, the beautiful sun of Austerlitz, and whenever the sun would shine brightly on, can we see that okay with the glare? Whatever. That the sun would shine brightly would bless the troops. Napoleon also, in reading his biography, a few fun facts, not a gourmand. We would think he was being French, but actually favorite food was often just a nice plate of macaroni. Also instrumental in inventing Braille when he commissioned his troops to have a term to communicate at night. And then the end of Napoleon, the Battle of Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's greatest defeat, exiled to Elba to live out the rest of his life, depressed, wishing he had killed himself. Waterloo, and people wonder, how did such a general lose at Waterloo? And now often when most war gamers replay Waterloo, it's actually the French who wins. Now I can make an entire lecture again on the Battle of Waterloo and why the French lost. But there's this whole theory that the reason Napoleon lost on Waterloo is actually piles, or hemorrhoids. Now why would Napoleon lose the battle because of hemorrhoids? Napoleon had quite a lot of health problems, and one of them being hemorrhoids. And there's this whole theory that goes on to say one of the reasons he had lost is that day he writes about being unable to mount a horse, it being very painful, and that the fact that he wasn't able to mount a horse and he was mostly trapped in his headquarters most of the day, inflicted with horrible hemorrhoids, that he couldn't win the battle. And that's something I depicted in some of, as this. Wait, we're okay. All right. My work, which is Sacre Bleu. Napoleon sits on his chamber pot the night before Waterloo, hoping his desires won't be obstructed. And now for Napoleon's enemy at Waterloo, the Duke of Wellington, and as we all probably know, the namesake of Beef Wellington. A very British gentleman, during the battle, a cannonball takes his head off next to him, and he just goes, hard pounding, gentlemen. At another point, a man loses his leg next to him, and he goes, by God, sir, I've lost my leg. To which Napoleon laconically replies, well, by God, sir, you have. And then after Napoleon at Waterloo, the Duke of Napoleon quite got the last laugh with seducing 2 of Napoleon's former mistresses, one of them actually saying the Duke was better in bed, and also being presented Napoleon's sword and a saucy painting of his sister at war's end. And actually now, if you go to his house in England, there is a large naked statue of Napoleon that Napoleon kind of hated, and the Duke got it. And then we have the Duke later in life next to his Stratfordshire figurine. The Duke would actually go on to live till 1852, being one of the few major Napoleonic commanders to actually be photographed. You know, we never think of Napoleonic commanders or Napoleonic soldiers. We have so few photographs of them. And now we're going to take a slight turn, step a little away for Stratfordshire, and I just want to talk about a few American presidents, especially some we don't talk about. I also found, besides the Stratfordshire pottery, a lot I looked at was these memorial plates and mugs. And here we have William Henry Harrison, our 9th president. Last president born as a British subject, and I loved his campaign slogan, log cabin and hard cider. Now, why do we know Harrison? Well, we know Harrison because he was that president who died after 32 days, slightly shorter than the life of a fruit fly. After giving the longest inaugural address on record, an hour 45 minutes, he would develop pneumonia, dying 32 days later. Here's an actual photo of Harrison and him on his deathbed. And, you know, Harrison, they say after, you know, he was the hero of the Thames in the War of 1812 and Tecumseh's War. And what happened was, they say Tecumseh put a curse on Harrison. They say the curse of Tippecanoe, every president elected in a year divided by 20 would die in office. And for a very long time, that proved true. I mean, we would have Harrison, we would have Harrison, 1840, die in office. We would have Lincoln, elected in 1860, die in office. We would have Garfield, elected 1880, die in office. We would have McKinley, elected in 1900, die in office. We would have Warren G. Harding, 1920, died in office. We would have FDR, 1940, died in office. And JFK, died in office, elected in 1960. And then actually, after Ronald Reagan survived his assassination attempt in 1981, elected in 1980, the curse would be broken. If the curse ever really existed, I don't know. I'd like to think it does. And William Henry Harrison's last claim to fame is the only president with a grandson president, and that would be Benjamin Harrison. And Benjamin Harrison, probably one of the most forgotten presidents, but the only fun fact I like about him is actually he would have the first electricity installed in the White House, but was actually too afraid to touch it and had to have his servants do it. But Frederick Douglass would actually say of Benjamin Harrison, to my mind, we've never had a greater president. Why he didn't say that about Lincoln, I don't know. I think it was probably that Harrison had elected him minister to Haiti, but who knows. And some work I've done on one of those presidential assassinations is President McKinley meets an anarchist. The assassination of President McKinley in 1901 at the Pan American Expedition in Buffalo, shot by Leon Czolgosz, an anarchist. Without any real guidance, McKinley would be shot in the stomach, linger for 6 days, and seem to rally and then die. With that piece, I'd done a whole series on the assassination of Garfield and McKinley. And why do we only talk about the assassination of Kennedy and Lincoln? Is Garfield or McKinley not to be remembered in cultural memory? And that was just a little aside. And now for a next ceramic piece on, these are all images I found in our archives here at Ryerson Burnham. Zachary Taylor, old rough and ready, our 12th president. And you know, the election he won would actually be the first ever election he'd vote for. Taylor would also actually die in office during a fundraising event for the Washington Monument, eating too many milk and cherries and dying a few days later. They think the new theory is that there was something in the water that he ate and it didn't go so well. Now, why did I show Zachary Taylor, and what does Zachary Taylor and William Henry Harrison have in common? This man, Dan Webster. Both Harrison and Taylor chose Dan Webster for their vice presidency. He rejected them both. I don't know if that's what killed him, but I was quite interested to actually see a little bronze sculpture of Dan Webster in our own Art Institute ourselves. And just, this man looks like he could kill someone. And that's the story of those two presidents. Next, we just want to quickly mention Stratfordshire also did a few plate series. For the Civil War, they didn't do as much work with the figurines. For America, there wasn't as much of a market for it, so they did a series of plates. Here is Major Ulysses S. Grant. Actual name, Hiram Ulysses Grant. It was a newspaper correspondent that spelled it wrong for Ulysses Simpson Grant. But Grant actually preferred the acronym of U.S. Grant to HUG. So he kept Ulysses S. Simpson's Grant. Now Grant, you know, Shelby Foote historian would go to say, Grant was 3 a.m. cool. he would get a note from his tent. His flank had been turned, which would a lesser general, scare them out of their pants. But Grant would continue on and become president, though his 12 cigars a day would eventually lead him being the first president really we know of that died of cancer. Also, Grant fun fact, favorite breakfast food would be cucumbers pickled in vinegar. Okay, and this is the reason I started talking about the presidents. Today is Grover Cleveland's birthday, and I said, I have to mention Grover Cleveland. Now, probably nobody really cares about Grover Cleveland, both our 22nd and our 24th president. But I care about Grover Cleveland, and some of the stories of his life I just had to tell. And here's a little campaign memento of him versus Ben Harrison, who I mentioned a little earlier. And here's Grover Cleveland, childhood nickname Big Steve, one of the hardest drinking men in Buffalo when he was a constable. Now, some of the stories from Garfield's life are amazing, or not amazing, shocking. Garfield would have relations with this woman, Maria Crofts Halprin, and one article states that she was date raped. What really happened, we don't know. He would later refer to it as his woman scrape. Anyways, she would become pregnant. Grover would never claim the child, but agreed to provide for it. But this became a whole scandal, especially after Grover Cleveland, not clear if he had her sent, but she was sent to an asylum for the mentally deranged, never to really be heard from again. And the son, he didn't really know what happened to the son. Some say he became an alcoholic, some say he became a successful businessman, we don't really know. But Grover became Grover the Good. His campaign slogan, always tell the truth. And James G. Blaine, in an enemy politician, they would say, first Garfield would say, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the continental liar from the state of Maine. So, and then they would go to make fun of Garfield. He would say, Ma, where's your pa? And then after Grover Cleveland wins the election, he goes, off to the White House, ha, ha, ha. But I love this little cartoon, another vote for Cleveland. But the story that I really was interested in Cleveland was this story, told through this wonderful book. I want to give a small shout out I read a few years ago. The President is a Sick Man. Anyone who could read a book on a small biography on Grover Cleveland, I will give some shout outs to. So what happened was this. Grant dies of cancer in '88. And at this time, there's such cancer phobia. I mean, it's not even called cancer, it's just called the dread disease or the disease. And one doctor goes on to say, the only thing we know about cancer is that we know nothing at all. I mean, even the first cancer hospital wouldn't even be called a cancer hospital. It was just, if anything, the cancer phobia stymied research. So the year is 1893. The panic of 1893. Grover Cleveland's in his second term, and he feels a rough spot on the roof of his mouth. It turns out it's cancer. It's a cancerous growth. Now, in the middle of a panic, it would be like in 2008 if the president had been like, well, I got a small cancerous growth on my mouth, I don't know. He couldn't do it. So he would tell everyone he was on a 4-day fishing trip while he was secretly having his tumor removed on his private yacht, the Oneonta, on the Long Island Sound. Here's actually a cast of Grover's top of his mouth before and after. But what the book goes on to talk about is he kept it such a good secret. No one had any clue about it. And then this man, E.J. Edwards, a newspaperman from Philadelphia, writes this giant expose on it saying Grover had a cancer, he had it removed, and Grover's PR team, and they completely denied it, and they completely defamed this man, E.J. Edwards, completely, he would die a pariah, him called a liar, even though in the end he had told the truth. Eventually, in 1916, when the last surviving surgeon of the operation would still be alive, he would go on to tell the truth about Grover Cleveland's tumor. And we can actually, if you're in Philadelphia, you can go to the Mutter Museum and see it yourself. And that was a little side trip in American President history. Now back to the Stratfordshire. This lecture is mostly focused on the military aspects of the Victorian era, just because it's something I'm passionate about, and I don't think there's many other lectures on Victorian military in SISC, so I wanted to do something a little different. So we have right now, the piece is titled Our Friends, Turkey, England, and France. And these are the three commanders or heads of state of the Allied forces of the Crimean War. Not the current conflict in the Crimea, but one that took place between 1854 and 1856. So we have the Sultan, we have Queen Victoria, and Napoleon III. The Crimean War, again, this is something I could do a whole lecture on its own, but the short and short of it is Britain and France would declare war on Russia after it declared war on the Ottoman Empire and Turkey to stop the expansive Russian influence. And, you know, the Crimean War, actually, one legacy we have it from in America after Russia would lose the war, they would become in such a debt that in 1867, Alexander II would sell Alaska to the United States and be somehow, until we found the major oil reserves in Alaska, would be known as Seward's Folly after Secretary of State Seward. And actually, the last survivor of the Crimean War was actually a tortoise named Timothy, who would die in 2448 years later after the conflict. I'm just going to do a quick cover over of some of the main battles of the war. The Battle of Balaclava. Balaclava, beautiful harbor, is what it was named after. And why do we know the Battle of Balaclava? For a few reasons. First, the ski mask now is, we know as Balaclava, which came after this battle when it was knit for the British troops by the English women at home. And then the most famous probably part of the battle is the Charge of the Light Brigade, the famous Tennyson poem of cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right of them, you know, into the valley of death did charge the 300. It would be a somewhat disastrous charge with about 40% casualties, but in the end, actually the charge was quite successful, actually achieving their goal. What had happened was the Russians had captured a few British cannon. And there was this whole thing, the sort of the cult of Wellington that I talked about Wellington earlier. Wellington had never lost a cannon, and neither was Lord Raglan, now the commander of the Crimean War. But as we'll see in the Crimean War, as I get to the Civil War, these disastrous headlong charges into entrenched positions, and which might have worked somewhat worked during the Napoleonic War, but certainly wouldn't work as the advances in firepower happened. Another incident from the Battle of Balaclava would be the Thin Red Line. We might have all heard this term. At the Battle of Balaclava, the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders are told to stand there and die firm. The actual quote was a thin red streak tipped with steel, which was mistranslated and misremembered as the Thin Red Line, which now has a memory of these British troops standing firm. Then we have the Battle of Inkerman. I'll speak less about this as there's not as many stories to be told, but another very deadly battle. I mean, in the 4 hours, the percent of casualties would equal nearly the British at the Somme 70 years later. It was known as, you know, a soldier's battle. It was more of these men in isolated positions of companies and regiments. And then, so these few battles happened. Once again, this is a very brief overview of the Crimean War. We have the final main end of the Crimean War and the siege of Sebastopol. The Russians are sieged up in their fortress of Sebastopol. So the British and French attack. The French attack, and this is a painting of the Russian forces inside the bastion of Sebastopol. The French attack the Malakoff and the British at the Redan, and once again, just murderous fire of these troops attacking entrenched position. I mean, one would say of British troops attacking the Redan, a more murderous fire of grape was never witnessed, and grape being grape shot instead of one large cannonball would be sort of a shotgun shell. Another quote about grape shot, of the idea of grape. Napoleon earlier would say, you know, when some revolutionaries are attacking, I think it was the Tuileries in the French Revolutionary Wars, he would say, give them a whiff of grape. Also, other odd Napoleon thing I forgot to mention, but I think it's quite odd. Actually, Napoleon's preserved penis is now owned by a doctor in New Jersey. Apparently looks like a shriveled gherkin. How it became to that doctor in New Jersey is quite the long story, but yes, do look it up. That is all true. Okay, and last little mention I want to mention of the man who made all this happen in the Crimean War is Lord Raglan. Near geriatrics by his time of command at the Crimean War. I mean, he was sent to command, what's the actual number of troops that he was sent? Yeah, anyways, he had never actually commanded troops in the field before. I mean, he had gained his reputation at Waterloo after being shot in the arm, having it removed without anesthetic, and then later asking if during the battle he could return to the battlefield and recover his arm so he could retrieve the ring his wife gave him. And there's an actual photo of Raglan himself. You know, Raglan was still the idea of the Napoleonic British soldier with your tall shako and your tight-fitting dress tunic, but as it would go on to be seen, that didn't really work in contemporary warfare. And then sort of something I've done with the Crimean War. This is a grenadier sapper of the Imperial Guard. I was very into the idea with the large bearskin cap, the leather apron, and it's so funny to see all these Stratfordshire figurines and then see work that I've done previously before even really knowing about them and what conversations they have. And now we'll go back a little to America in the general timeline of history, the 1850s. John Brown. I had gone, the raid on Harper's Ferry, martyrs started the Civil War. I'd gone to this lecture at the Chicago Civil War Roundtable about what is John Brown's legacy, and it depends where you're from. Iconoclast, religious zealot, martyr, or terrorist. I think it depends where you come from, how you see John Brown. Be someone here from New Jersey, you can see John Brown very differently as someone from Alabama. But what's not so known about John Brown is his other nickname, Powhattamie Brown. During Bleeding Kansas, him and his followers would hack down 45 pro-slavery men with broadswords. And we think of John Brown as the savior, but I mean the idea of Powhattamie Brown. And so begins the Civil War. Now, once again, this is the only other part of the lecture is not Stratfordshire. They really, the time England was going on, there wasn't such an interest in doing Stratfordshire figures of the Civil War, and actually I don't think, besides maybe one of Grant made during his presidency, I couldn't really find any. But a lot of memorial plates were made. So right here we have the Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's Charge, and we can see on top George Gordon Meade, Google-eyed snapping turtle, Robert E. Lee, his nicknames from Granny Lee to the Ace of Spades when in the beginning of the war he made Southern troops dig entrenchments, to James Longstreet, my old war horse, Lee would call him, Old Pete, and then Winfield Scott Hancock, Hancock the Magnificent. Something that always attracted me, the Victorian era, is that every single one of these generals would always have some quirky nickname like Old Wooden Head or Cerro Gordo or Old Bory, and that's how they were known. Anyways, Pickett's Charge. I mean, I don't want to go too deeply in Pickett's Charge because we all know the story of Pickett's Charge, but 50% casualties, once again, Confederate troops in transposition, the high water mark of the Confederacy. But one thing I do want to impress is that the name Pickett's Charge is wrong. I don't think we should be calling it Pickett's Charge. It puts too much blame on Pickett. The correct term is actually the Pickett-Pettigrew-Trimble Assault. Will that ever really spread around? No, probably not. But Pickett was only one of 3 divisions to actually take part in the charge. And here's the man, George Pickett himself. And Pickett's later life has always intrigued me also. He would never forgive Lee for that order to charge at Pickett's, to charge on that field of battle. He would say, that man destroyed my division. And then he also was somewhat humorous about it. When asked about what went wrong at Pickett's charge, he'd say, I think the Yankees had something to do with it. And that's some work. And now I wanted to show that stuff about the Civil War because a lot of my work has to do with the Civil War. It's just such a time of change. And I think, before the Civil War, we said the United States are, you had much more state allegiance. You were a New Yorker, you were a Californian, you were a Virginian. But after we said the United States is. And here are some little stories. I was interested in telling stories of these generals from the Civil War. We have Ambrose Burnside. This piece is titled Sideburns. Now, why do we know Ambrose Burnside? The term sideburns, the famous mutton chops. Burnside would command the Union forces during the deadliest day of the war at Fredericksburg, offering 3 consecutive charges, bloody, failed charges, offering at the head of his division to carry the 4th charge on at the head of his column. Luckily, he was persuaded out of it. Anyways, Burnside was not unfamiliar with blows of adversities, having once wooed and persuaded a Kentucky woman to accompany him to the altar, only to have her respond to the minister's final plea with an abrupt and emphatic no. Through these stories, I wanted to tell the stories of life through these Civil War journals. The idea of going to your wedding, have your wife say no to being left, to the story of Earl Van Dorn, Buck Van Dorn, Southern Beau Sabre, the Bayard Lochinvar of Ladies' Dreams, or the quote that got me, the terror of ugly husbands everywhere. I don't think there was a woman in the South this man didn't sleep with at the time. Anyways, that would go on to be his undoing, Fortune's broad smile broadening ever further, he would go back to his apartment to work on new plans for harassment of the enemies and see his current paramour, Miss Jessie Kissack Peters, wife of a local doctor. When Fortune's broad smile turned out fickle after all, and the said doctor himself interrupted them and promptly shot him in the back of the head. I mean, this was a piece I dealt with having relations with dealing with infidelity with girlfriends and being caught. And what is being caught? To the story of Jeb Stuart, the main Southern cavalry commander. Jeb Stuart, another gaudy, flashy cavalry commander with his golden sash, his red cape, his ostrich feather plume, his knee-high boots, his white leather gauntlets. Now, the only problem with him was that his father, Philip St. George Cooke, was the Union cavalry commander. And through this piece, I wanted to look at family relationships and what does it mean to not get along with your in-laws, especially if your in-laws fighting the war against you? So this is sort of a dinner at the Cooke-Stewart household goes awry, you know. And the quote that attracted me to the scene of Jeb Stuart was, when he learned that Cooke would stay with the old flag, he would say, "It is a decision he shall regret but once," and by that continuously. It would soon turn out that Jeb Stuart would actually be killed a few months later at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, and George Cooke would go on to live 30 more years in the Army, none of them regrettable. So the piece is titled A Lifetime of Regret. And now back to, and don't worry, we're nearing the end of this long journey, the Franco-Prussian War. And again, this is another thing, I could do a whole lecture on the Franco-Prussian War, but the year is 1870. I mean, one of the most monumentous years in history. We have the death of Dickens, Dumas, Robert E. Lee, the end of the War of the Triple Alliance, where plucky little Paraguay would go on to have a war with Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, and have 70% casualties of all their troops by the end, sending troops in aged between 5 and 10. 1870, I mean, we have Rockefeller found Standard Oil, Stanley finds Livingston, ruins of Troy begin getting dug, and the Brooklyn Bridge begins construction. Italy is unified. And so we have Napoleon III, Prince Louis Napoleon. I mean, as much of a sexual appetite as he did his more famous uncle, but a man of contradictions, and it's said had he lived in a different time, he could have been Europeans' greatest statesman. In the end, he was the sole pillar of a crumbling republic, or empire, sorry, the Second Empire. So he goes on to command the French troops in a war with Germany. As Kissinger, writes in this article, the Franco-Prussian War was the beginning of a modern 100 years war, from the Franco-Prussian War to the First World War to the Second World War, of this book on Franco-German relations. I can highly suggest, if anyone wants to learn more, Alistair Horn's wonderful trilogy on the subject, I can highly suggest. So, he goes up to war, he says, "Do your duty," his wife says. And he said, he's going to say, "Il ne fait rien brusque," I do nothing rushed. But he would begin the war with, as the book Alistair Horn goes on to say, an attack brusque. And the war begins. It goes horribly. And I'll tell the story of that in a little bit, but I just want to show here Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, realpolitik. His wife, though, not the finest character. I mean, his wife would say, his wife would actually ask him to have every French man, woman, and child killed. But what Bismarck would actually quite presciently say would, he would say, "One day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish things in the Balkans." And but 26 years later, Archduke Franz Ferdinand would be assassinated. The Balkans powder keg, as they would say. The main German commander, Moltke, the only man to actually have his voice recorded from the 18th century. And the Battle of Sedan, Sedan in French memory, it was, it was the idea of Zirkelschlag, this all-encompassing battle, and the French troops were decimated. I mean, Napoleon III was there riding around his horse in front, hoping a cannonball would take him out and put him out of his misery. And Sedan, in cultural memory, it became such a rallying point of never again, They would say of Sedan, "Speak of it never, but think of it always." And the last little character I'll mention from the Franco-Prussian War is Marshal Acile Bazaine. They talk about Bazaine at Metz. It became this idea in cultural military memory of what would happen is he commanded this French army, but even though he had superior forces, he was immured in the fortress of Metz, refusing to leave, smoking all day, playing billiards all night as the Germans, surrounded him. And the idea of becoming a Bazaine at Metz formed itself in military memory of being trapped in your fortress and vacillating. But what did him in at Metz was actually the lack of salt. It was the salt to cook these fine French sauces for the rats they were now stuck eating. Eventually, a few months in, Bazaine would surrender his forces, and he would walk out, most of the troops sullenly drunk, and Bazaine would be spat on. And what is this verdict of this man? Was he a traitor that he didn't do it? I mean, I think the verdict goes on to say is that, you know, he was claimed a traitor, but in general, indifferent, general with enthusiastic Republican, nothing worse. A fate that, you know, he would actually be exiled, a fate that would take up Pétain, commander of the French 70 years later. And now we have, as we move into the 1880s, Sir Garnet Wolseley, possibly the greatest British military mind since Wellington. You know, they would come into the phrase, all Sir Garnet, when everything was in tip-top shape. I mean, this man commanding all these wars, the wars of, you know, Queen Victoria's little wars. We think of this time as a time of Pax Britannica, the British peace, based off Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But it wasn't. I can't even name all these little wars on the fringes of the empire, from the Anglo-Ashanti War, the Anglo-Zulu War, the Anglo-Sikh War, the Anglo-Persian War, the Anglo-Burmese War, the Anglo-Mori Wars, I mean, the Anglo-Boer Wars. The list goes on. And most of them would be commanded by Wolseley, starting off his career leading a charge in the First Anglo-Burmese War. Luckily, he fell into the ditch a few yards into the charge and was knocked unconscious, as the charge was a total failure. Later the day after recovery, he offered to lead the second charge, which was actually luckily much more successful. Hold on. Sorry. This is Wolseley. That was the other guy. My bad. Excuse that. So, anyways, Wolseley. And the only thing that really took away from him, he would go on to say, before he died in 1900, he would say, the great battle of Armageddon will be between China and the United States. Now, has that happened yet? No, but he goes on this really interesting lecture about how the Chinese are ever evolving, as we can even see now with the growth of China and America, as Trump says, make America great again, so who knows. And now for Charles Chinese Gordon. How did he get the name Chinese Gordon? Well, that's the story of the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion has been sort of glossed over in American history because it took place during the same time frame as the Civil War. During the Taiping Rebellion, about 20 million Chinese would die after one man, Hong Xingguang, pronounced that horribly, but would claim Jesus was his brother. And they go on to, this book goes on to state, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom. There were so many troops that it would make Grant commanding the Grand Army of the Republic seem like a mere lieutenant in comparison. So Gordon would command the ever-victorious army of the imperial forces in that war. The army was actually not that victorious, but the name stuck. So in 1884, when some of these sort of latter-day jihadists were taking over the Sudan, or what at the time was the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, they said, there's told in the famous story of Charlton Heston and the movie Khartoum, they said, send Gordon to Khartoum. Anyways, Khartoum is besieged, and the Mahdi, the leader of these tribal Mahdist forces, would have Gordon, he would be killed along with most of Khartoum about 2 days before the release force came. And Britain was very sad. There was a ton of Gordon and Stratfordshire figurines, but in the end, one man, maybe in the minority, would say the man was not worth the camels. And we're going to talk about two more little figures and then wrap it up. Okay, we have Lord Kitchener, the K of K, as you would say, or the supreme warlord of the British forces. Kitchener would, after in the Sudan, there would be the whole Battle of Omdurman after Wolseley, after Gordon had been killed to crush the Mahdist forces and gain control of the Sudan for Britain, and at his command was Kitchener, very stern-faced, and as they would say of him, the machine of the Sudan. And the Battle of Omdurman obviously would not go so well for the Mahdist tribesmen, attacking with mostly spears and sticks against entrenched Maxim guns and Krupp artillery. And they would say it was not a battle, but an execution. But we probably all know Kitchener from this famous poster, "Your country needs you," which Uncle Sam would later take from "America needs you." And he would later die in the First World War from when his ship would hit a mine as he was the Secretary of War, and he was going to Russia to go talk about armaments there. You know, Kitchener would be very also prescient about the First World War, saying, you know, most people thought in the First World War, the Kaiser would say, you will be home before the leaves fall from the tree. You know, the war would take a month. They would crush Paris as they did in the Franco-Prussian War, but Kitchener knew the war would slog on to a year of attrition and create the PALS battalions of the Battle of the Somme and mass recruitment drives. I'm going to kind of gloss over MacDonald because he's not as important, but here I just want to quickly show the 21st Lancers at this Battle of Omdurman, the last great Lancer charge of all time. And they were known as the Death or Glory Boys. I mean, some of the name of these British regiments, the nicknames, you know, one of the 29th Foot, which would be at the Boston Massacre, the Vein Openers, to the Steelbacks, another regiment, which were for their pride and not flinching when they got flogged, to the Middlesex Regiment, the Die-Hards. During one battle they said, die hard, men, die hard. And then later, you know, they'd say, at Abuela. And later during the Crimean War, there'd be in another battle, they'd say, die hard, men, remember Abuela. Or spell it, Abuela. And then here's my own little version, I guess, of the Lancer in my own little ceramic work of the idea of a Lancer. Lancers, especially people using a lance only 110 years ago. So anachronistic. And then the last little Stratfordshire figure I'm going to show is Sir Redvers Buller. And the only reason I'm going to give him a shout out of all they found, I think it really captured his look the best. And his little quote was, a stern-tempered, ruthless man with a gift of grim silence. And he would lead the British forces to disaster at the Boer War. And they would say, an admiral captain, an adequate major, a barely satisfactory colonel, and a disastrous general. And just 3 quick slides of some work I've done with my own version of Stratfordshire figurines. You know, Hitler, actually, this is Adolf Hitler, and if we can see right here, this is a painting he did, or a drawing of Pinocchio, actually found behind a painting in Norway a few years back, signed A.H. in the little corner. Hitler was actually a huge fan of Disney, and when Goebbels gave him, I think it was Snow White for his Christmas gift, he said it was the best gift he'd received that year. So with these as a contrast in conversation with the Stratfordshire, what are these real stories? Now, did Hitler ever put on his bunny ears and draw Pinocchio? No. But I do like to imagine Hitler sitting down drawing Pinocchio. Or Marat, you know, the death of Marat, the martyr of the French Revolution, stabbed by Charlotte Corday in his bathtub. But I like to imagine Marat before his bath, the idea of actually, to reference, like, imagine Bobby Darin's splish splash, I was taking a bath. You know, he would actually die on a Saturday, and, you know, the Bobby Darin song on a Saturday night. So, you know, as the story goes, splish, you know, splish splash. Marat takes a bath thinking everything was all right, you know, rubber ducky in hand. And the last little figure I guess I'll show is the story of, you know, Custer. You know, last in his class at West Point, to be killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn, Custer's last stand, to be killed with all 5 companies of his 7th Cavalry. But I want to imagine Custer before Little Bighorn, you know, sitting on the floor of his tent, his cinnamon-scented ringlets on the hair, playing cowboys and Indians with his toys, as I do with my sculptures. Thank you, everyone, for putting through that. If you want to ask me some questions, sorry it was a little all over the place. Yeah, and I guess do that. I just wanted to show some cool aspects of history. I hope you guys remembered something and learned something. And yeah. Yes? Oh, I think it was cut off by the medical examiner at the time. How it ended up in the doctor's house, I think it was sold at a somewhat under-the-rug auction in the 80s, and the guy's quite secretive of it, and now it resides in Jersey. What? Wait, say it again?
They kept nothing of him but his dick.
Well, I mean, the rest is in his tomb, is in the Invalides in Paris, and his death mask, too. I mean, that's about it. Oh, and here's Ben also. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah?
Can you talk a little bit about the function of the history and the retelling of these narratives on an epic scale, the kind of the hubris of battles and of power and conquest, in relation to the more impotent qualities of manufacturing the Staffordshire figurines, like their size, the economy means of their production, kind of like the speed of the brushstroke, the kind of the cheapness of the collectible, that sort of function of it being nostalgic or very kind of like democratic. Yeah, can you talk about like I guess the distance between those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my research with these Stratfordshire figurines, I had seen them in passing very briefly. But the idea that, I mean, I didn't mention here, what did I write? You know, these women, you know, that these 200 kids a day would be sculpting these figurines, getting silicosis from the thing. And in the end, they were made to like project these great figures of Wellington or, you know, Gordon or Kitchener, you know. But in the end, you know, I write, here we go. Some jobs even caused the children's hands to bleed. Other inhabitant towns of the affected smoke choked there, and many people developed tuberculosis. I mean, the idea that 200 of these little figures could be made a day. And I guess with my work, the Stratfordshire, through almost immoral means to make them, it tells the story of these great figures. And me, I don't know if I'm getting silicosis, I doubt it, but I sit there and I make my own figures and like, try to tell their story, but the real story, not the idealized, perfect. And it's like, in the end, what is history but a construction of events? And I'd like to think my work's like that. And in the end, Stratfordshire's kind of like that. The idea that we'd all remember Napoleon or Wellington and put him on our mantelpiece. But in the end, that these little figures had quite a lurid history, as like the real figures that I make have quite a lurid history in that no one is, you know, nothing I guess is above, no one is beyond above reproach. Hope that made sense, sir.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a question.
Yep.
I have a couple of questions. So
Sure.
the Stratfordshire figurines, when you were describing them and showing kind of images of the characters, photographs of the characters, oftentimes there was a real similarity between the construction of the photo and the pose captured in the figurine. Can you just talk about the relationship between the photo as a media that was meant to kind of like spread the renown of the character versus the figurine, and how they work differently? In particular, because I find the figurines to be kind of ridiculously without skill. There's no skill, and maybe it's because they were kids.
Yeah.
You know, and so it just reminds me that you don't need a lot of prompt. Like, you know, prompt of memory to recall what you want to recall about a figure, and the expression of skillfulness is not necessarily important. I guess the question is about the photo and the figure, and what ought to be remembered in the figure, and what do you think about that?
I think in the end, these figures, they were mass produced, you know, as I said, the G.I. Joes that we could remember the mythologies by. In the end, you know, let's scroll back up to one.
They were hand built, right? And not,
They were, no,
were they slip cast?
yeah, they were slip cast little things. When the first ones were all, as I put, they were, yeah, it was mostly just slip cast, a simple two-part little thing. Like, let's go to an example. What's a good one? Here we go. Yeah, as we can't really see, but this is just a simple little thing. I mean, it's like this. That famous print of Napoleon, you could go to you could go to the museum and see that. But for the average home, everyone wanted a little something. Or let's use Wellington, because not many, the death of Wellington. You know, it's like, this was such a little thing. You could go get at your local pottery store in your town. And there would be lithographs and stuff that would be printed the same, but those were not for the common people. You know, this was a nice little tchotchke, as I almost want to think of it, that you could just put above. And most of these images are based off a famous image. Yeah, famous image, or a lot, honestly, were from lithographs, because I think the height of, I want to say, one of the heights of, they had a few like ups and downs, but 1830s were really hot, 1840s, but it wasn't later. It's funny because like I saw a lot later from the Franco-Prussian War, Garnet, Wolseley, but I think there's a varying degree of the skill involved in the Stratfordshire. I mean, for some ones which are very clearly Napoleon too. When I looked later at the ones from this whole series from the Franco-Prussian War to you know, here, I don't know if there was less of an interest, but they might use a much simpler frame of just a man on the horse, and if he had a certain stash, they'd paint it that way. Because I think by this point, now in the 1870s, there's so many more new things of media. You could actually have a photo of Garnet Wolseley. But then also, I think it's the same like this. It's like, how many people were really putting a photo of Garnet? Well, it's like there's something I think to be said about having a photograph of a military commander, yet having a little, you know, memento on your fireplaces. I don't know how to put it, but it's like, it seems odder to have a photo of this general unless you were a soldier in some real relation. But if you had a little memento, it's something you could put above your fire. You know what I mean? It's smaller, out of the way.
And it makes me think about the durability and kind of travelability of the ceramic figurine as the proper carrier of the memory of this person and the persistence of the memory of the person, meaning that it really doesn't take a lot to reconstruct what you think is the significant element of that person in your life. And maybe there's something about that fidelity that is more appropriate in ceramics than in photographs. And it kind of just the whole dynamic just works better. But I appreciate coming into contact with those ideas through your lecture.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. No. It was just I think there were so many ways this lecture could have gone, and it's like I think I like talking about history, you know, and I think in the end no, no. Yeah. And if anyone, I guess now, you know, I've kept you all here for at least an hour and a half. So, but if anyone, you guys want to ask me about my research and stuff I've done on my own with reading, I'd be happy to talk about it. And yeah, unless there's any other questions. If you have any questions for Ben also, I think we're gonna.
Thank you guys.
Okay, Ben. No, thank you too. I'll text you later.
Very well.
All right.